So, welcome everyone, and welcome especially to Professor Max Bazerman from Harvard Business School. Professor Bazerman, I have many friends and colleagues who went to Harvard Business School, but I don't think I know anyone who teaches there. So I'm very excited to have you here for the Substack. And as I was telling you, before just a little while ago, because we got on early, I'm a big fan of your work. I came across, so I first, of course, when I decided to write about complicity, came across your book, Complicit, How We Enable the Unethical and How to Stop. And of course, you can't really talk about complicity without talking about cognitive psychology. And so, of course, I've also have your book, Blind Spots. So I'm familiar with your work, but do you want to quickly just talk about your area of expertise, what you focus on, what you teach? As just sort of some background for the people who are tuning in?
Sure. First, thanks for inviting me to join you. I would say broadly, my perspective that I bring to a variety of applied problems is the lens of behavioral decision making, sometimes now called behavioral economics. I see my work as heavily rooted in the ideas of Kahneman and Tversky, but I've applied them first to the area of negotiations and I do a lot of my teaching on the topic of negotiations, where I study what we can learn about how our minds work that limit our ability to come up with effective resolutions to conflict. More recently, I've spent more of my time looking at how we can understand the behavior of perfectly good people who just happen to do bad things on a pretty regular basis. And from there, I've applied that to a wide variety of problems. From a philosophical perspective, I'm certainly very influenced by Peter Singer, and I think of myself as somebody who tries to do more good in the world and aim in the direction of doing as much good as I can with my limited time available.
Thank you for that. And for everyone who's tuning in, normally how this works, if you haven't come to one of these speakers before, put in your questions in the chat. And what I try to do is just integrate those into my conversation with the speaker so that we can make sure to kind of address the things that are on your mind. And I know that all of you have questions about how people can go along with things that are are wrong, and then I guess be able to justify it. So let's start there. In your book, Complicit, you I think it's so important to think about complicity as a spectrum, right? The different people kind of identify different profiles or different parts along the spectrum, but you have seven different categories in the book. And I'm just wondering if you could kind of characterize how you think about complicity, what that spectrum looks like, um, and then we can kind of dive into some of the more specifics.
Sure. The book is divided into two parts essentially. One part is when people are intentionally complicit, so that they know that they're doing something that will potentially harm others, but they're in it for themselves and how they can benefit. And in many ways, intentional complicitors are people who we label bad guys and we kind of know who they are. And I think that they're far less interesting because the press is writing about them all the time. So you could think about, pick your evildoer, and we can find the people around them who were in it for their own particular benefit. For me, the more interesting group are nice people like all the people who would kind of join your Substack, who are perfectly good human beings, good citizens of their community, contribute to philanthropic causes, but yet might, in fact, be complicit in a variety of ways, allowing bad behavior to continue. And I find that much more interesting because in so many cases, if it wasn't for us nice people who were impulsive complicitors, the bad guys couldn't get away with their wrongdoing on a pretty regular basis. So I kind of feel like the intentional category, um, which gets the most press, um, they're not the psychologically most interesting. The psychologically most interesting are those of us who are complicit, and I'm saying that's most of us, if not all of us, and we're not aware when we're doing it.
I love that for two reasons. So first, as a lawyer, I can tell you that it also drives me crazy that we always focus on these central bad actors. And I would go even further, Professor Baserman, and say that we not only focus on them exclusively, but we use criminal law as the only yardstick. In other
Right.
words, if they're not charged and they're not convicted, then I guess everybody's off the hook. And we can look at something like Jeffrey Epstein
Hmm.
to see that that is not a great yardstick because most of the people that were in his circle are not never going to be charged, but I wouldn't say that any of us would think that they're off the hook. And the other thing that you said that I think is really worth noting is that all of us are capable of becoming complicit.
Hmm.
And so I would love to get your thoughts on that because your book Blind Spots gets into this a little bit, right? That we all believe, or most of us believe, that we're good, rational, ethical, honest people who do good things. And you make a distinction between the should self and the want self. And
Hmm.
can you unpack that and how that plays out in our everyday life?
Sure, there are so many pieces there, Asha,
Yeah.
that were
Go
terrific.
with whatever
Um,
you
so,
think
so
is
let me
the
unpack a
yeah.
bunch of them, and then you tell me which ones I missed. So first of all, I'm not a lawyer, so don't get your legal advice from me. But I'm a little bit appalled by the degree to which society lets people off of the hook for allowing bad behavior to occur. So we punish. Um, acts of commission, but we don't punish acts of omission, and we let sort of leaders off the hook when they can blame their subordinates for the bad behavior, even though they may have created the environment where those bad behaviors could be anticipated. So if I think about the Wells Fargo story, where they set goals for people throughout their organization to sell useless and dangerous products to their customers, and then the leaders kind of deny responsibility because they didn't sell the product to the customers. They simply created an environment that if you weren't doing so, you were unlikely to last in the organization. So I think we have a problem with our legal system when kind of we create that separation from did you engage in the bad behavior yourself versus causing the bad behavior to occur in some ways. So I think that's worth rethinking, certainly in an organizational context. So often we're in the business of creating environments in which others will act, and sort of should people be held responsible for that. So I think that a lot of us, if we kind of took an outside perspective, if we could take a step removed and define the person that we want to be, um, or the person that we should be, um, uh, we would have a moral standard that would be higher than many of us act. So I think that there's an awful lot of us who think that if we saw sexual harassment occurring, we would do something about it. If we saw someone engaging in mild fraudulent behavior, we would act on it. But yet, when the moment comes, there's something awkward about it, and we often don't take a forceful action and treat it as kind of none of our business. In my own world of academic fraud, um, one of the things that's interesting is some of the most famous cases of academic fraud were uncovered because a graduate student talked to another graduate student, and they both realized that their superior was engaged in bad behavior. alone, they didn't want to stand up stand up and accuse a superior of bad behavior. But once they found out that they weren't alone, they felt more comfortable kind of acting on it. It became clear to them what they should do, and the fact that they may have wanted to kind of hide and duck and pretend that the bad behavior wasn't occurring. They weren't able to, and they then had the courage to move forward with a companion in hand. So tell me, which of your many good comments, questions that you asked, have I not addressed in that?
No, you've addressed a lot. I think one good example of the unwilling, like the discrepancy between who we think we are and who we are, we have seen actually in play when you have the press gaggle interviewing President Trump, for example, and he'll say something horribly sexist and misogynistic
Hmm.
and, whatever, quiet piggy and nobody says anything. And you
Yeah,
know that they're colleagues and you know that there are many, you know, allies and people who care about that kind of commentary, but I think you're getting to something which is the fear of being the only one to say something.
absolutely. And it is kind of interesting that, in a world where protesters certainly may have a fear that they're being filmed, perhaps because there's good reason for them to have a fear that they're being filmed. Um, when it becomes in vogue to show up at protests, it empowers people to do exactly that, to get over their fears, to take, and I'm not saying that there isn't a risk, but to take the small risk in order to do the right thing. And at some point, Malcolm Gladwell has the term tipping point. At some point, there's a tipping point in which case it seems like the normal thing to do is to show up at a No Kings rally versus when there's a smaller number of people, we often just duck our heads and don't show up.
Um, So in turn, I want to integrate some of the questions that are here. And you talked about the spectrum of complicity, that there's the people who do it intentionally, then there's the way on the other end that we're all complicit. And I know you talk about kind of broader things like, privilege and like implicit bias and things like that. So there's two questions here. We're going to specific people and how you would assess them in terms of complicity. And maybe we can also talk about how you define complicity. So one, Frank is asking about Vice President JD Vance's complete 180
Hmm.
on how he sees Trump. Like, how does that process happen? And how does one just, I mean, I know I have my own view on that, which is that these are just not people who have strong convictions. I mean, if you watch the play Hamilton, I always think of them as sort of the Aaron Burr figure, talk less,
Uh-huh.
smile more, kind of go with wherever the wind is blowing. But I'm interested in your thought. And then somebody like the CEO of United Healthcare, Dean, is asking, you know, um, yeah, leaders in companies or industries that have uh I mean healthcare is I guess in one spot, they're denying coverage, et cetera, to people. Then you have down the line, you have like social media platforms and gun manufacturers. So wh I guess we can talk about corporate complicity and what you think about where these types of leaders of these industries or companies fall on your spectrum.
Sure. So let's go to JD Vance. So in the book Complicit, which was written between Trump administration one and Trump administration two, I write a fair amount about Mitch McConnell and Lindsey Graham, who had both been highly critical of Trump when he was running for election. They I'm not too wild about either of their politics, but I don't see much evidence of a history of sort of support of white supremacists. I certainly didn't see any support of destroying democracy. But once Trump is elected, they dropped their criticism of Trump and they went along.